The dress had been sewn over 3 consecutive nights. Cora knew this because she had stayed awake alongside Lady Aldwyn, the seamstress of the village who had raised her after her parents died, holding the spool of thread while the old woman's fingers moved swiftly over the cream linen fabric with golden thread embroidery along the hem. It was not silk. It was not velvet. It was not the kind of fabric that lords' daughters wore when they entered the great hall of Castle Veyrath, but it was the finest they had, and the hands that made it were full of love. She had arrived at the castle that afternoon with a single trunk, a handwritten invitation, and a heart beating far too loudly for her own good. The invitation had come from Dorian Ashvale, son of Lord Ashvale, a high-ranking beta of the Veyrath pack, and the man who had spent 2 years visiting the village where Cora lived, bringing modest gifts, speaking softly, promising loudly. He had said, with his own words on a night of thin rain at the doorstep of Lady Aldwyn's cottage, that he would present her to the pack, that he would choose her before everyone, that it did not matter that she was an Omega without family, without title, without a pack of origin. That what mattered was her. Cora had believed that. Perhaps because she wanted to believe. Perhaps because no one had ever said her name the way he said it. Perhaps because she was 23 years old and had a heart that had not yet learned to distrust promises made by candlelight. The grand banquet of the crescent moon took place once a year in Castle Veyrath. It was the occasion when the lords and alphas of neighboring packs gathered to forge alliances, celebrate the moon, and, more often than not, announce bonds. It was a night of choices, a night when the fate of many was sealed before hundreds of witnesses, and Dorian had asked her to come. The hall was enormous. Cora stood at the entrance for a moment that felt far too long, looking at the torches burning in wrought iron brackets along the stone walls, at the pack banners descending from the ceiling almost to the floor, green and silver of the Veyrath pack, deep red and gold of the Mordecai pack, dark blue of the Cairn pack, at the long tables covered with food and wine, at the musicians in the corner playing lute and flute with skilled fingers. There were hundreds of people. She smelled them before she saw them individually. The scent of high-status wolves was distinct. It carried wood, iron, earth, and something she could not name but recognized instinctively as power. Hers, by comparison, was simple. Field herbs, washed linen, the faint smell of candle wax from Lady Aldwyn's cottage. Nothing that would draw attention. She found Dorian near the central column, speaking with 2 men wearing lords' cloaks. When he saw her, there was a second, just a single second, where something crossed his face that she could not quite read. Not joy, not relief, something more like calculation. She told herself she had imagined it. Cora. He came to her, kissed her hand briefly, and smiled in that careful way of his. You look well. You look well. Not beautiful, not radiant, not what she had spent 3 sleepless nights hoping to hear. Thank you, she said quietly. He guided her to a seat at one of the side tables, not beside him at the main table, where lords and their companions sat, but further back among faces she did not recognize. People who looked at her linen dress and looked away just as quickly. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and told herself it was fine, that the evening had only just begun, that he was simply tending to obligations before he could be with her properly. She waited through the first course. She waited through the second. The wine was good, dark and warm, tasting of blackberries and something resinous she could not name. And she drank a single cup slowly, watching the hall fill with laughter and music, and the particular kind of energy that comes when powerful people feel safe enough to be loud. She watched Dorian. He sat at the main table, beside a woman she did not know. The woman had silver blonde hair pinned with a clasp of moonstone, a gown of deep green silk that caught the torchlight, and a laugh that carried across the hall as though designed to be heard. She was beautiful. She was obviously noble. And Dorian leaned toward her with an ease that he had never once showed toward Cora in 2 years of visiting her village. Cora set down her cup. She was still telling herself she'd imagined it when the announcement came. Lord Aldrich Ashvale, Dorian's father, a broad man with iron-gray hair and the cold eyes of a wolf who had survived decades of pack politics, rose from his seat at the head of the main table and lifted his goblet. The hall quieted gradually, conversations dying away like candle flames snuffed one by one. "Friends and allies," Lord Aldrich said. His voice was practiced, authoritative, the voice of a man accustomed to rooms falling silent for him. The Crescent Moon banquet has always been a celebration of bonds, of choice, of the future our pack intends to build. He paused, letting the silence hold its weight. "Tonight I am honored to announce that my son, Dorian Ashvale, has chosen his companion. A match that will strengthen the ties between Veyrath and the noble Cairn pack." The silver-blonde woman beside Dorian lifted her chin slightly. Cora felt the hall tilt. "Lady Seraphine of Cairn," Lord Aldrich continued, "welcomes the bond with grace and honor. The formal ceremony will take place at the next full moon." Applause moved through the hall like a wave. Cora did not move. She sat with her hands still folded in her lap and her wine cup half full beside her plate, and watched Dorian raise his goblet toward his father without once looking in her direction. Not once. As though she were simply not there. As though the 2 years of visits and soft words and a promise made at a cottage doorstep in the rain had never existed at all. The woman sitting beside Cora, an older servant she had not spoken to all evening, leaned slightly away, as if proximity to humiliation were contagious. Cora breathed in once, slowly, through her nose. She was not going to cry. Not here. Not in front of hundreds of wolves who had better scent than sight, and would smell her grief before she could hide it. She was not going to make a sound. She was not going to stand up too quickly, or knock anything over, or give anyone the satisfaction of watching her fall apart in a borrowed seat at a side table in a hall where she had never truly belonged. She stood up carefully. She smoothed the front of her linen dress, the dress that Lady Aldwyn had sewn for 3 nights without sleeping, with golden thread along the hem, because she had believed that Cora deserved to enter a room and be chosen. And she walked toward the nearest corridor without hurrying, with her chin level and her shoulders straight and her hands perfectly still at her sides. No one stopped her. No one even looked. She followed the corridor away from the noise of the hall, turned once, turned again, and then simply kept walking until the music became a distant murmur behind thick stone walls, and the torches grew fewer, and the air grew cooler, and the only sound was her own footsteps on the flagstone floor. She did not know how long she walked. She did not know which part of the castle she had entered. She pushed open a set of heavy double doors at the end of a long gallery, because they were there, and she needed something to do with her hands, and she stepped into darkness and cool air and silence. Then she stopped. The room was vast. Even in the near dark, she could sense the scale of it, the ceiling impossibly high above her, the floor stretching wide and smooth and pale beneath the silver light that fell through a row of tall, arched windows along the far wall. The moon was full and low and generous tonight, and it flooded the room in a kind of light that had no warmth, but had something else instead. Clarity, perhaps. The sort of light that showed things exactly as they were. It was a ballroom. Empty. Silent. Abandoned for the evening while every living soul in the castle was packed into the great hall, celebrating a bond that had just quietly destroyed something she had been foolish enough to trust. Cora stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then, very slowly, she walked to the center of the floor. There was no music. There was no one watching. There was nothing but moonlight and stone, and the distant muffled sound of a celebration she was no longer part of. She lifted her arms, and she began to dance. She did not dance the way she might have danced if someone were watching. There was no performance in it. No careful positioning of the arms. No deliberate grace. No awareness of how the hem of her dress swept the floor, or how the moonlight caught the gold thread at the edge of the fabric. She simply moved the way she had moved as a child in the meadow behind Lady Aldwyn's cottage, when the grass was tall enough to hide her, and the wind came low and warm from the southern hills, and there was no one to judge the shape of her joy or the honesty of her grief. She moved through both now, grief and something older than grief. Something that had no clean name but lived in the chest just below the collarbone, in the place where hope had been sitting quietly for 2 years, making itself small and patient, waiting to be acknowledged. It had not been acknowledged. It had been simply overlooked, erased, as if it had never existed at all. She turned slowly in the center of the floor, arms extended, head tilted back toward the high ceiling she could barely see, and let the silence hold her the way no one at that banquet had bothered to. She was not performing sorrow. She was not dramatizing her own humiliation. She was simply moving through it, the way water moves through a narrow passage, not because it chooses to, but because it has nowhere else to go. The moonlight shifted slightly as a cloud passed somewhere above the castle. She slowed, then stopped. She stood alone in the center of the empty ballroom with her arms at her sides, and her breathing even, and her dress perfectly still around her feet, and she allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of absolute stillness. 10 seconds to feel the full weight of the evening, the side table, the careful kiss on her hand. "You look well," the announcement that had rolled across the hall like thunder. The applause, Dorian never once looking in her direction. 10 seconds. Then she lifted her chin, dropped her shoulders, and exhaled. She had walked out of that hall with her dignity intact. She had not wept. She had not raised her voice. She had not given anyone the pleasure of watching an Omega from a village fall apart because a Beta's son had made promises he never intended to keep. She had simply stood up, smoothed her dress, and walked away. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. She would leave in the morning. She would return to the village. She would sit in Lady Aldwyn's kitchen and drink the bitter tea the old woman always made when something in the world needed facing, and she would let the old woman scold her for having trusted him, and she would not argue, because Lady Aldwyn would be right. But she had tonight first. And this room, empty and silver and vast, felt more honest than anything else she had encountered since arriving at Castle Veyrath. She began to move again. He had come to the ballroom for the same reason men like him always sought empty rooms during celebrations. Quiet. Lucian Veyrath did not enjoy the grand banquet of the crescent moon. He endured it, which was not the same thing. He endured it because it was his castle, his pack's tradition, his obligation as Alpha King to be present when lords and allies gathered and ate his food and drank his wine, and reminded themselves that the crown resting in the vault below the East Tower belonged to the man standing at the center of the room. Presence was politics. Visibility was power, or at least the performance of it. But he had been performing since before the first course, and by the time Lord Aldrich Asheville made his announcement, and the hall erupted in congratulatory noise, Lucian had already quietly excused himself from the high table. No one stopped him. They rarely did. There was a particular quality of stillness that he carried. Something in the way he occupied space that communicated without words that he had made a decision, and the decision was final. His second in command, Caspian, had tried once to describe it to a visiting lord who had asked why the Alpha King seemed to move through rooms as though the rooms had been built specifically to accommodate him. Because they were, Caspian had said, which was not precisely what the visiting lord had meant, but was also not wrong. Lucian walked the gallery without a torch. He did not need one. His sight in darkness was precise and effortless, the particular advantage of a wolf whose bloodline ran older and deeper than most of the noble families currently eating at his tables. He had mapped this castle since childhood. Every corridor, every stairwell, every chamber that connected to every other chamber, through passages that the architects had long forgotten, and the servants had never known. He knew where he was going before he arrived. The ballroom was his thinking room. It had been since he was a boy watching his father pace the length of it during difficult winters, working through problems that would not resolve themselves in the presence of advisors and politics, and the constant noise of a ruling pack. There was something about the scale of it, the ceiling, the windows, the floor, that made everything else proportionate, smaller, manageable. He pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped inside, and stopped. There was someone in his ballroom. His first instinct was immediate and wordless, a sharpening of attention that he had learned over years not to express outwardly. He simply went very still in the doorway and looked. A woman, young, mid-20s perhaps. A dress of cream linen with gold thread at the hem, which told him she was not from among his noble guests, but had clearly made an effort. Dark hair loose around her shoulders. No jewels, no clasp, no symbol of any pack affiliation he could identify. She was dancing. There was no music. He confirmed this immediately and with some confusion, because the absence of music made the movement strange, and also, somehow, more striking. She was not performing any formal court dance he recognized. The steps had no pattern he could trace, no structure, no awareness of audience. She simply moved through the moonlit space with her arms raised, and her eyes closed, and her face tilted upward, and the gold thread at the hem of her dress caught the light each time she turned, and scattered it in brief warm arcs across the pale floor. He stood in the shadow of the doorway, and did not announce himself. He told himself it was because interrupting someone in that state of privacy would be unnecessarily unkind. He did not examine the other reasons too closely. She slowed. She stopped again, standing still in a pool of moonlight with her arms falling gently to her sides, her breathing visible in the slight rise and fall of her shoulders. He could hear it from where he stood. Steady now, controlled, the breathing of someone who had decided something. And then, very faintly, he caught her scent. It moved across the room on the cool air from the high windows, and reached him with a specificity that made him go very still in a different way than before. Not the alertness of surprise. Something older, something that lived below language. Field herbs, clean linen, candle wax, and beneath all of that, something else. Something that had no equivalent in any scent he had catalogued in 32 years of living inside one of the oldest alpha bloodlines in the known packs. A warmth that was not heat. A depth that was not weight. Something that the oldest texts, the ones kept in the sealed archive beneath the castle library, described in language so archaic it required a scholar to translate. He had read those texts. He had not believed them. He believed them now. She began to move again, and he watched her, and the distant sound of music and laughter from the great hall seemed to come from a different world entirely, one he had no particular interest in returning to. There was a sound in the corridor behind him. Footsteps. Multiple sets. The particular cadence of men who were trying to move quietly and were not quite succeeding. He recognized them without turning. Caspian, and at least 2 of the inner guard, who had evidently decided that the Alpha King had been absent from the banquet for long enough to warrant finding. He turned slightly and held up one hand. The footsteps stopped. He heard Caspian draw breath to speak, and silenced him with a single look over his shoulder, a look that required no words, and conveyed with complete precision the instruction to remain exactly where they were and make no further sound. Caspian closed his mouth. Lucian turned back to the doorway. The woman in the ballroom had stopped again. She was standing with her back partially toward him now, looking up at the row of arched windows and the moonlight that poured through them, and he could see her face in profile. The clean line of her jaw, the slight lift of her chin, the particular expression of someone who is not resigned, but has simply decided to be honest with themselves about something difficult. He had seen that expression before. He wore it himself sometimes, in rooms where no one was watching. He should announce himself. He knew that. She did not know she was being observed, and there was a line between watching someone in a moment of genuine private grief and allowing that observation to continue past the point of propriety. He was aware of that line. He was also aware that he had not moved, that he was standing in the shadow of his own ballroom doorway, watching a woman with no title and no pack and a linen dress sewn with gold thread at the hem, dance alone in the moonlight, and that something in him, something old and certain and utterly unhurried, had already made a decision that his mind had not quite finished articulating yet. Behind him, Caspian shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. Lucien did not turn. "Go back to the hall," he said quietly. "Tell them I will return shortly." A pause. "My lord," Caspian said equally quietly. "Is everything—" "Go back to the hall, Caspian." Another pause, then the sound of footsteps retreating. Lucien looked at the woman in the moonlight. She had not heard. The stone walls were thick, and his voice had been low. And she was still turned slightly away, still looking at the windows with that expression of quiet, composed honesty. He leaned one shoulder against the door frame, and he waited. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps. He made none, or none that reached her through the thick quiet of the ballroom. What she heard was a shift in the air, a change in the quality of the silence, the way silence changes when it is no longer empty, but occupied. She had grown up in a village small enough that she had learned to read the presence of others through subtler signals than sound, the way a candle flame bends slightly toward an open door, the way the temperature of a room adjusts itself around a body that has entered it. She turned. There was a man in the doorway. She did not recognize him immediately, which meant very little. She knew no one at Castle Veyrath except Dorian, and Dorian was currently raising a goblet to a silver blonde woman in a silk gown. What she registered first was not his face, but the way he stood. One shoulder against the door frame, arms loose at his sides, completely still in the manner of someone who had been there for some time, and had made no effort to announce himself. He was watching her. The moonlight did not reach the doorway directly, but enough of it scattered and reflected from the pale stone floor that she could see him with reasonable clarity. Dark clothing, a tunic of deep charcoal, a cloak pushed back over one shoulder, no visible ornamentation except for a single ring on his right hand that caught a brief gleam of silver when he shifted slightly. Dark hair, a face that was angled and serious, and gave away nothing whatsoever about what he was thinking. He was tall. Not in an exaggerated way, but in the way that some men are tall without seeming to be making any effort about it, as though height were simply one of several qualities that had settled onto him quietly and without ceremony. She stood perfectly still in the center of the moonlit floor and felt heat move up the back of her neck. She had been dancing alone in an empty ballroom with no music, eyes closed, arms raised, grieving a man who had never deserved it. And someone had been watching. "How long?" she said, and was grateful that her voice came out level. "Have you been standing there?" "Long enough," he said. His voice was low. Not soft. There was nothing particularly soft about it. But low in the way that certain sounds are low, carrying without effort, filling the space between them without needing to try. She had the irrational impression that he could whisper in this room and be heard perfectly. "This is the ballroom," she said, because she needed to say something, and her dignity had already had a difficult enough evening without her standing mute in front of a stranger who had watched her dance alone in the dark. "It is," he agreed. "I thought it was empty." "It was." He paused briefly. "Then you arrived. Then I arrived. It has been full of people ever since." She blinked at that. There was something in it. Not quite humor, but adjacent to it. The kind of dry observation that lives just at the border of irony without crossing into mockery. She could not tell if he was laughing at her. She decided after a moment that he was not. "I apologize," she said. "I didn't know anyone would be here. I'll go." She moved to step around him toward the door, and he shifted. Just slightly, just enough to suggest without blocking. The difference between a man who wishes to prevent and a man who simply wishes to be acknowledged. "You don't have to," he said. She stopped. "I was not making a complaint," he continued, in that same level tone. "I was making an observation. The room is not empty. That is simply a fact. It does not require you to leave it." She looked at him for a moment. "You watched me dance," she said, "without announcing yourself." "Yes." "That was not particularly courteous." "No," he agreed without any apparent distress about this. "It was not. I could offer you a reason, but I suspect it would not improve your opinion of the situation significantly." She studied him. He did not fidget under the attention. He simply stood there and let her look, with the particular patience of someone who has never in his life felt the need to fill a silence. "Try anyway," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. The faint suggestion of movement at the corner of his mouth that might, under different circumstances, become something warmer. "You were not performing," he said. "People who know they are being watched perform. Even when they believe they are alone, most people perform for an imagined audience. You were not. It seemed worth observing." She was quiet for a moment. "That," she said slowly, "is either a genuine observation or the most unusual form of flattery I have encountered." "I don't flatter," he said. "I find it wastes time that could be spent saying accurate things." She looked at him for another long moment. He still had not moved from the doorway, still held the same loose, unhurried posture, still watched her with those dark eyes that gave away almost nothing, and somehow communicated everything anyway. "Who are you?" she asked. Something passed across his face at that. Not surprise, exactly. More like the brief, private acknowledgement of a man encountering something he had not anticipated, and finding it considerably more interesting than whatever he had anticipated instead. "Lucian," he said. Just the name. Nothing attached to it. No title, no pack affiliation, no the son of or the lord of. Simply Lucian. The way someone gives a name when they want it to be received as a person rather than a position. "Cora," she said, because it seemed only fair. He inclined his head slightly. Not a bow. Too minimal for that. Too mutual. An acknowledgement. "You were at the banquet," he said. It was not a question. The warmth in her neck shifted into something cooler. "Yes." "You left early." "I had seen enough of it." He did not push, did not ask what she had seen, or why it had been sufficient to drive her from a celebration into an empty ballroom at the far end of the castle. He simply accepted the statement with that same unhurried patience, and let the silence settle again without apparent discomfort. She found, to her own mild irritation, that she wanted to fill it. "The Lord's son," she said, before she had fully decided to. "Dorian Ashvale. He invited me here. There were things he said over a period of time that led me to believe the evening would go differently than it did." She stopped. She had not intended to say that much. "I apologize. You did not ask." "No," he said, "but I'm not sorry you told me." She looked at the floor briefly, then back at him. "He announced a bond tonight, with a woman from the Cairn pack." "Lady Seraphine," Lucian said. She looked at him sharply. "You know her?" "I know everyone at my tables." His tables. She heard it a half-second after he said it, and the understanding arrived slowly, not dramatically, not with a rush of embarrassment, but steadily, the way cold water rises. She looked at him again, the ring on his right hand, the quality of his stillness. The way the guards she had half noticed in the corridor behind him had receded at what she could only assume was a single gesture. His tables. His ballroom. "You are the Alpha King," she said. "Yes," he said. She waited for some secondary reaction to arrive. Mortification, perhaps, at having danced alone in the dark while the Alpha King watched from the doorway, or at having complained to him about Dorian Ashvale as though he were a stranger at a tavern who had asked the right question at the right moment. the mortification did not come. What came instead was something quieter and considerably more difficult to name. She had told him the truth about her evening without knowing who he was, and he had listened to it. Actually listened, without the slight lean away from discomfort that most people performed when an omega with no status said something honest, and had not looked away. "I've made rather a fool of myself," she said. "In front of you, I mean. The dancing, and then the explaining." "You danced honestly in an empty room because you needed to," he said, "and you explained something true without dressing it up in more dignity than it required. I don't see the fool in that." She was quiet. "Ashvale's son," Lucian said after a moment, and his voice had shifted very slightly. Still level, still controlled, but carrying something beneath the level surface that she could not precisely identify. "He invited you here with the intention of a public choice." It was not a question either, but she answered it. "That was what I understood." And then announced a bond with another woman. "Yes." A silence. "That is," Lucian said, with a precision that was somehow more cutting than anger would have been, "a significant failure of character." She looked at him. "It is also," he continued in the same even tone, "the kind of failure that reveals considerably more about the man who committed it than about the woman who trusted him." Something in her chest moved. Not dramatically, not the great heaving shift of someone whose grief has been suddenly resolved, because grief did not work that way, and she was not naive enough to think it did. But something small, and quiet, and real, like a door opening in a room that had been shut for a long time. She had not expected kindness from a king in a dark ballroom at the end of a ruinous evening. She had not expected to feel, standing in the empty space of her own humiliation, that someone had looked at the full shape of it and found her. Not the situation, not the pathos of it, but her, worth addressing directly. "Thank you," she said. It was simple, and she meant it. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, unhurried eyes. Then he pushed off the doorframe and walked into the room. Not toward her, not directly. He moved to the side, toward the row of arched windows, and stood looking out at the moon for a moment. She watched him. His profile was as unreadable as his face had been, and yet there was something about the set of his shoulders and the tilt of his chin that suggested he was not as indifferent as his stillness implied. "The banquet will continue for another 2 hours," he said to the window. "You are not obligated to return to it." "I wasn't planning to." "Good." He paused. "This room is preferable." She blinked. Are you planning to stay here, instead of your own banquet?" He turned his head slightly, and this time the thing at the corner of his mouth was unmistakable, brief and dry and genuine. "It appears so." She looked at him standing in the moonlight beside his own castle's windows. The Alpha King, who had watched her dance alone in the dark and had not announced himself because she had not been performing, and she felt something shift in the architecture of the evening. Not repaired. Nothing about what Dorian had done was repaired, but rearranged somehow, set in a different light. "There's no music," she said. "No," he agreed. "I was dancing without it before. I noticed." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her, steady and unhurried and utterly serious, and said nothing further. Because he was apparently a man who understood that some things did not need to be said in order to be understood. She lifted her arms slowly and began again. This time, she was not alone. He did not dance. He simply stood at the edge of the moonlight and watched her, and the quality of his watching was so different from the hidden observation of before that it felt like an entirely different act. He was not a stranger in a doorway now. He was a man who had told her his name and listened to her truth, and chosen, quite deliberately, to remain in the room. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough. She did not sleep well. The chamber she had been given, a modest guest room in the east wing, stone walls, a narrow bed with wool blankets, a single window that looked out over the inner courtyard, held the particular chill of rooms that are cleaned regularly but rarely occupied, and she lay awake for a long time listening to the castle settle around her and thinking about nothing she wanted to think about. Dorian she disposed of quickly. That grief was real, but it was also clean. The grief of a promise broken, not the grief of something truly lost, because she understood now, lying in the dark with the clarity that comes after midnight, that she had been in love with the version of Dorian she had constructed from his words, rather than with the man himself. The man himself had always been slightly out of focus. She had simply chosen not to notice. What she could not dispose of as easily was Lucian. She turned onto her side and looked at the window. She had danced for perhaps another quarter of an hour after she lifted her arms the second time, and he had stood at the edge of the moonlight and watched with that steady, unhurried attention. And when she finally slowed and stopped, he had said nothing immediately. Just looked at her with those dark eyes that gave away precisely as much as he intended them to give away, and not a fraction more. Then he had said, very quietly, "You should sleep. The morning will require decisions." She had not asked what decisions. She had the feeling he would not have answered with anything more specific than he considered necessary. She had simply nodded, and he had walked her, not escorting her exactly, but moving alongside her through the corridor in a way that made the distinction feel irrelevant, as far as the east wing staircase, and then had inclined his head in that minimal, mutual way of his, and turned back toward whatever obligations waited for an alpha king at the end of his own banquet. She had stood at the bottom of the staircase and watched him go, and told herself she was simply noting the exit, which was useful information for the morning. She had not convinced herself. She rose before dawn. The courtyard below her window was gray and still, a thin mist sitting low over the cobblestones, and she could hear the distant sounds of the castle beginning its day. A blacksmith's hammer somewhere in the outer ward, the creak of a gate, the low voices of the guard changing their watch. She dressed in her traveling clothes, folded the cream linen dress carefully, and placed it back in her trunk, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment with her hands in her lap. She would go to the stables. She would arrange for her horse. She would leave before the castle's noble guests woke and dressed, and came down to whatever morning meal was served in the great hall, and she would not have to walk through another room full of people who had watched her sit at a side table the night before, and had looked away. She was nearly at the door when the knock came. It was not a tentative knock. It was 3 precise, unhurried sounds on the wood. The knock of someone who expected the door to be answered, and was simply providing the courtesy of announcing themselves before it was. She opened it. The man in the corridor was not Lucian. He was perhaps 30, with sandy hair and a face that was open and quick, and currently wearing an expression of professional pleasantness stretched over something that might have been genuine curiosity. He wore the colors of the Veyrath pack, deep green and silver, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to delivering messages that people were not expecting. "Mistress Cora," he said, "I'm Caspian. I serve as second to the Alpha King." A brief pause. "He has asked that you join him for the morning meal. In the East Solar, not the Great Hall." She looked at him. "That is," Caspian added, with a slight adjustment of his pleasant expression that suggested he was choosing words carefully, "an invitation, not a summons." He was very specific about that distinction. She believed that. It was precisely the kind of distinction Lucian would consider important. "The East Solar," she said. "I can show you the way." The East Solar was a smaller room than she had expected, not intimate exactly, because nothing in a castle of this scale could be truly intimate, but proportioned for conversation rather than ceremony. A round table near the window, 2 chairs, a fire already burning in the hearth despite the early hour, a spread of bread and cheese and dried fruit, and a pot of something that steamed gently and smelled of herbs. Lucian was already there. He was standing at the window when she entered, looking out at the courtyard below. dressed more plainly than she might have expected. Dark tunic, no cloak. The silver ring on his right hand, the only thing that caught the early light. He turned when she came in, and something in his face shifted in that minimal way she was already beginning to recognize as the equivalent, in another man, of a considerably more expressive reaction. "You were going to leave," he said. It was not an accusation. It was simply accurate. "Yes," she said. There was no point in pretending otherwise. He would have known the moment he saw her traveling clothes. "Sit down," he said. "Eat something first." She sat. He sat across from her, and for a few minutes neither of them spoke, which she was learning was not uncomfortable when it was him. He poured something from the clay pot, a warm drink of herbs and honey, slightly bitter at the edge, the kind of thing that settled the stomach and cleared the head, and pushed it toward her without comment. And she wrapped her hands around it and was grateful. "The Ashvale family," Lucian said, when she had eaten a little, "has been a subject of attention in my council for some time." He said it the way he said most things, level, precise, without visible emotion. "There are concerns about their conduct toward members of lower rank within the pack structure, specifically regarding promises made to secure loyalty or cooperation, followed by a failure to honor those promises." She was still for a moment. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that Dorian has done this before." "I am telling you that the pattern exists," he said. "The specifics are a matter of ongoing council deliberation and not something I would share with anyone outside that deliberation." He paused. "I am also telling you that what happened to you last night was not an isolated failure of one man's character. It was part of something larger, and it was not your fault, and it was not invisible to people who have the authority to address it." She set down her cup carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" He looked at her for a moment with those dark, steady eyes. "Because you were owed honesty last night and were given the opposite," he said. "And because I find that I object to the idea of you leaving this castle believing that what happened reflects something insufficient in you, rather than something corrupt in him." The fire in the hearth shifted and settled. Outside the window, the mist was beginning to lift from the courtyard, the pale early light finding the edges of the stone and making them sharp. "It is a long ride back to your village," Lucian said. "Half a day," she said. "I've done it before." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I would like to ask you something, and I want you to understand that your answer will not change anything I have just told you, and will not be held as a commitment of any kind." She looked at him. "Ask." "Would you consider staying," he said, "for a few days? Not as a guest of the pack in the formal sense, simply here, in the castle, while the council deliberates on the Ashvale matter, and while you decide what you want your next step to be?" She studied him. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that she was beginning to understand meant he was choosing accuracy over convenience. "Because your scent," he said, "is not something I have encountered before. And I do not mean that as a thing said to impress or to unsettle you. I mean it as a fact, and as an alpha king whose bloodline carries responsibilities that most people in this castle do not fully understand. It is a fact I cannot in good conscience simply allow to walk out the east gate on a horse before I have had the opportunity to understand it." She stared at him. "My scent," she said. "Yes. You are keeping me here because of how I smell." The corner of his mouth moved. "I am inviting you to remain," he said, "because of how you smell. There is a significant difference, and I would again like to emphasize that the answer no is entirely available to you." She looked at him across the round table with the fire burning beside them, and the mist lifting outside, and the castle waking up around them. And she thought about Lady Aldwyn's kitchen, and the bitter tea, and the 3 nights of sewing that had produced a dress she had folded back into a trunk at dawn. And she thought about Dorian saying, "You look well," and never once looking in her direction during the announcement. And she thought about an empty ballroom and moonlight, and a man in a doorway who had watched her dance because she was not performing. "What does it mean?" she asked. "My scent. What do you think it means?" He looked at her steadily. "I think," he said, with that precise, unhurried honesty that she was beginning to trust precisely because it never tried to be more than it was, "that you may be something the oldest records in my archive describe in language that most scholars consider symbolic rather than literal." He paused. "I am no longer certain they were right to consider it symbolic." The fire crackled. She picked up her cup and drank the last of the warm herb tea and set it down. "I'll stay 3 days," she said. Something in his face shifted. That minimal movement, that almost expression. 3 days, he agreed. The archive was beneath the east tower. Lucian brought her there himself on the second morning, carrying a torch through a stairwell so narrow that his shoulders nearly brushed both walls, descending 2 full floors below the castle's foundations into a chamber that smelled of old stone and dried ink, and the particular dusty warmth of rooms where paper has been kept for a very long time. The ceiling was low and vaulted, the shelves carved directly into the rock, and the volumes stored on them were bound in leather so old it had darkened almost to black. Cora stood in the center of the chamber and turned slowly, reading the spines she could make out in the torchlight. "These are the oldest records of the Veyrath line," Lucian said, setting the torch in a bracket on the wall. "Some of them predate the castle itself. They were kept in a different structure, in a different era, and moved here when the current foundations were laid." He crossed to a particular shelf and ran his fingers along the spines without hesitation, a man who knew exactly where everything was. "This one." He drew out a volume and placed it on the reading table at the center of the room. She came to stand beside him and looked at the open pages. The script was old, not illegible, but requiring attention. The letters shaped slightly differently than modern hand. The ink faded to brown at the edges of each page. "Here," he said, and pointed. She read. It took her a moment to parse the archaic phrasing, and then another moment to understand what she was reading, and then she was still for a long time. The anchor Omega, the text called it. Not a rank in the conventional sense, not the social designation of Omega that the pack hierarchy used to denote those of lowest status. Something older. Something that the text described as appearing rarely, perhaps once in several generations, carrying a scent that registered differently to wolves of deep alpha bloodline, not as subordinate, not as lesser, but as fundamental. Grounding. The oldest word the scholar had used, translated imperfectly from an even older tongue, was something close to cornerstone. Where the anchor walks, the text read, the pack holds. Where she is absent, something essential is missing, though the pack may not know to name it. She looked up from the page. Lucian was watching her with those dark, steady eyes. "You found this after last night," she said. "I did not need to find it," he said. "I have read it many times. I simply did not expect to encounter what it described in the middle of my own banquet." A pause. "Or in my ballroom afterward." She looked back at the page. "This could mean anything," she said. "Old texts say many things. Scholars interpret them according to what they want to find." "Yes," he said. "That is true." He did not argue further, which was more persuasive than argument would have been. She thought about what she had felt since arriving at this castle. Not the humiliation of the banquet, but something underneath that. Something that had nothing to do with Dorian or the announcement or the side table. A feeling of recognition she had not been able to name. Not of Lucian specifically. Not at first, but of the castle itself. The stones, the air, the way the corridors felt less like a foreign place and more like a map she had somehow forgotten she already knew. She had told herself it was simply the strangeness of the evening making her fanciful. She was no longer entirely certain. On the third morning, Caspian came to find her in the East Solar, where she had taken to sitting after breakfast, reading a volume of Veyrath pack history that Lucian had left on the table the previous evening without comment, simply placed it there and gone to his council meeting, and trusted her to decide whether she wanted it. She had wanted it. Caspian sat across from her with the ease of a man who had long since accepted that his role included conversations his lord was not quite ready to initiate himself. "He's going to ask you to stay," Caspian said, without preamble. "Beyond the 3 days. I thought you should know that before he asks, so you have time to think about it without him watching you think, which I imagine is somewhat pressurizing given that he watches everything with the same expression." She looked at him. "Does he know you're telling me this?" "He would not be surprised," Caspian said, which was not precisely an answer. He also resolved the Ashvale matter this morning, in council. Dorian Ashvale and his father have been formally censured. The pattern of conduct has been documented and entered into the pack record. There will be consequences for future violations. He paused. "He wanted you to know that too, but he was going to tell you himself this evening, and I thought morning was better." She was quiet for a moment. "You're very forthcoming for a second in command," she said. Caspian smiled. It was a genuine smile, quick and warm, the smile of a man who found the world consistently more interesting than it had any obligation to be. "I've served Lucian for 11 years, he said. "In that time, I have watched him walk into rooms and walk out of rooms and conduct council meetings and negotiate with allied lords and manage a pack of several thousand wolves with complete competence and very little apparent interest in any of it beyond the obligation." He paused. "Last night, I watched him tell 3 visiting lords, 2 of them senior to any lord currently in residence, that he had matters to attend to, and then spend 2 hours in the East Solar asking me questions about pack integration protocols for individuals without a pack of origin." She stilled. "He was asking," Caspian said gently, "how someone who had never belonged to a pack would go about belonging to one, what the process required, what the obstacles were, what the rights of such a person would be upon formal integration." He stood, tucking his hands behind his back, in a posture that was almost formal, but not quite. "I thought that was also worth knowing before this evening." He left her with the book and the fire and the particular quality of morning light that came through the East Solar window, and she sat for a long time without reading. Lucian found her in the ballroom. She had gone there in the late afternoon, not to dance this time, but simply to stand in the space that had somehow become the most honest room she had encountered in this castle. And she was at the window looking out at the forest beyond the outer wall, when she heard the door. She did not need to turn to know it was him. "Caspian told me he spoke with you this morning," Lucian said. "He did. I would apologize for that, except that what he told you was accurate, and I would have told you the same things myself this evening, only less efficiently." She turned from the window. He was standing where she had first seen him, not in the doorway this time, but just inside it, with the late afternoon light coming through the high windows and falling across the pale floor between them. "The 3 days are finished," she said. "Yes." "You want to ask me to stay?" "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "Though I want to be clear about what I am asking. I am not asking you to stay because of what the archive says, or because of what your scent means to the oldest part of my bloodline, or because of any obligation the texts describe. Those things are real, and I do not intend to pretend otherwise." He paused, and something in his face shifted. Not the almost expression, not the minimal movement she had learned to read. Something more open than that. Something that cost him slightly more. "I am asking you to stay because for the first time in a considerable number of years I have sat across a table from someone and found myself unwilling for the meal to end." The ballroom was very quiet. "That is not a declaration," he said. "I am aware that we have known each other for 3 days, and that you arrived at this castle under circumstances that were not designed to leave you favorably disposed toward any of its occupants. I am not asking you to feel what I feel. I am asking you to stay long enough to find out whether you might want to." She looked at him. She thought about Lady Aldwyn, who deserved a letter, and would receive one by the week's end. She thought about the village and the meadow behind the cottage, and the life that had been small and honest and hers. She thought about a cream linen dress with gold thread at the hem, folded carefully in a trunk, and the 3 nights of love that had gone into making it. She thought about empty ballrooms and moonlight, and a man who had watched her dance because she was not performing, and who had listened to her truth without leaning away from it, and who had spent 2 hours the previous night asking his second-in-command how a woman without a pack went about belonging to one. "I'll stay," she said. Something moved through Lucian's face, not the almost expression, not the minimal shift. Something genuine and unguarded that she thought he probably did not show often, and which made him look, for a brief moment, considerably less like a king, and considerably more like a man who had been waiting for something, without being certain it would arrive. He crossed the floor toward her. Not quickly. Unhurried, as everything about him was unhurried. And stopped at a respectful distance and looked at her with those dark eyes. Then he held out his hand. Not a gesture of ownership, not a command. Simply an open hand, offered, waiting. She looked at it for a moment. Then she placed her hand in his. The formal pack integration ceremony took place 6 weeks later, in the great hall of Castle Veyrath, before the assembled lords and allies of the Veyrath pack. It was not a bond ceremony. That would come later, in its own time, on terms they had discussed quietly over many evenings in the East Solar, and the Archive and the Ballroom, where they had taken to walking together after supper, in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill the space between them. The integration ceremony was something else. Something that in the oldest texts had a name that translated approximately as the claiming of a cornerstone. The formal recognition, before witnesses, that a woman without a pack had been seen, valued, and welcomed not as a guest, or a ward, or an obligation, but as someone essential. Someone who belonged. Cora stood in the center of the great hall, in a gown of deep green velvet, not linen, not borrowed, but made for her specifically by the castle's seamstress with input from Lady Aldwyn, who had made the journey from the village and was currently seated in the front row, with the expression of a woman who had always known things would turn out this way, and was gracious enough not to say so. Lucian stood before her. He took both her hands in his, which was not part of the formal protocol, and Caspian, standing to one side with the pack record open, elected not to mention this. "Cora of no pack," Lucian said, in the carrying voice he used when a room needed to hear him, "is known to this pack, is seen by this pack, is welcomed into the Veyrath line not by conquest or obligation, but by recognition and by choice." He looked at her, and his eyes were dark and steady and entirely honest. "The choice is mutual." In the front row, Lady Aldwyn pressed her lips together in a way that suggested she was not going to cry, and was moderately successful. Caspian made a notation in the pack record. The hall applauded. Dorian Ashvale was not present. He had left Veyrath territory with his father 3 weeks prior, following the formal censure, to answer for their conduct before a neutral council of allied lords. He would not return. Whatever he had imagined he was discarding when he looked away from a side table and raised his goblet, he had understood the full weight of it approximately 4 days after the banquet, when word reached him through the usual channels of gossip and messenger that the woman he had overlooked had been asked to remain at Castle Veyrath by the Alpha King himself. By then, it was, as Caspian had observed to Lucian one morning with considerable satisfaction, comprehensively too late. That night, long after the ceremony, and the supper, and the slow departure of the guests, Cora stood alone at the window of the East Solar, and looked out at the courtyard below, and listened to the castle settle around her. Not a foreign sound anymore. Hers. Lucian came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and they stood together looking out at the dark courtyard, and the stars above the outer wall, and the forest beyond. The same forest she had seen from this window on the first morning when she had been drinking herb tea and deciding whether 3 days was long enough. Lady Aldwyn approves, Cora said. I know, he said. She told me so directly, at some length. She laughed. A real laugh, uncalculated, the kind that came from somewhere genuine. She felt him turn to look at her when she laughed, and she let him look, because she had learned that his watching was not observation for its own sake, but attention of a particular and serious kind. The attention of a man who intended to keep looking for a very long time, and wanted to do it honestly. No more empty ballrooms, she said. The ballroom is yours whenever you want it, he said. Empty or otherwise. She turned from the window. He was looking at her with those dark, steady eyes, and she reached up and placed her hand briefly against his jaw. The first time she had touched his face, and he was very still for it. The stillness of someone receiving something carefully. And he turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to her palm, brief and warm and undemanding. A promise. Not the kind made in rain at a cottage doorstep and forgotten by morning. The kind made in archive rooms and morning meals and evenings spent walking a moonlit ballroom in comfortable silence. The kind that had been built, quietly and honestly, from the ground up. She lowered her hand. He kept hold of it. They stood at the window while the castle finished settling around them, and the fire burned low in the hearth, and somewhere in the outer ward, a wolf called once to the rising moon, and was answered, and Cora of Veyrath, cornerstone, pack-claimed home, did not feel the need to dance alone anymore. She was at last exactly where she belonged.